So I'm going to go ahead and read. We're in Mark. We're going to be reading the second chapter, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.'" Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus.
Thanks, Lynn. I'll take it. All right. Thank you for leading us in both those things, Lynn. That was special. All right. This is a very difficult passage. It's difficult in an entirely different way than last Sunday, which I know we haven't even gotten to the hard part yet. Very difficult than last Sunday, which was, I think, immediately applicable, but emotionally challenging. Just a hard pill to swallow. How do I reorient my life around this? This is difficult because parts of it feel foreign. There's an element to this whole idea of who cares? Why do I need to care in the 21st century America about ideas like Sabbath? I don't believe this is an old and dead idea. My hope this morning is to simply increase your value of what Jesus says about the Sabbath in your life, that you would believe it, that you would practice it, that maybe you come to love it, because it is a gift of grace from Jesus to you. So let's dive back in here, and you'll see that this is an intentional theme. Sabbath, 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 all over the place. This is the first time in Mark that we've seen Sabbath. So this word had not appeared yet in the gospel, and now it's here and it's everywhere. It's one of those Jewish words, Hebrew words, that a lot of people have heard of, right? Like you don't have to dig too deep to possibly at least have heard of the idea of Sabbath, and then some of what you might assume is meant by it: Saturday, day off, rest, etc., etc. And so we got a conflict here. Our conflict has been introduced. The Pharisees have been around in Mark so far, and Jesus has said some things that sort of needled them, and there's a little bit of rising tension. And now the beginning of real conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees is introduced, and it's riveting. The forces are closing in around Jesus, trying to undermine his mission and his discipling. And they're trying to disqualify Jesus' disciples. And the first real shot in the Gospels is fired. They ate grain. It's a really dumb fight. It's a really sad fight. It's a pivotal fight, though. And I think this is an ongoing fight that you and I are going to wrestle with, especially in modern, accomplishment-obsessed, screen-oriented America. Right? I made it sound silly, and it's got some foreign words, but it's not really that silly. I think this does intersect with our world. And the fight that takes place over this is this main idea that according to Jesus, Sabbath is a pointer, not the point. And as he says that, we're encountering people who are, I think, not willing to believe that. They think Sabbath was the point. So Sabbath, which is a practice given in the Old Testament, and we will look at it in a little more detail of what it is and all that. But the idea of Sabbath, the practice of Sabbath, the rhythm of Sabbath, teaches us something about God. But now God's right here, standing in front of them. He's telling them what the intended purpose of Sabbath was. And he's teaching the people that Sabbath has quite a lot to do with our faith in him. And by understanding that, we can do Sabbath better. And by doing that, our lives are blessed. So let's go all the way back. This is when this was introduced. Genesis chapter 2, the origin. Genesis chapter 2. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating he had done. If you're anywhere around a kid's story about creation, this usually makes its way in there. God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he did not create anything. A lot of people are familiar with that. And so this is the beginning of the introduction of this very, very strange, very God-originating idea of work and not work. And so we get it here for us that he rested and rested. This is one of those where the English is a little bit less helpful. The word Sabbath does not literally mean rest. It works very well here to apply it in that way. But if you're just in a vacuum with the word Sabbath, what that means is stop. Sabbath, literally translated, is desist or stop. And so in contrast, God had been creating and then he rested. So it works, but if the only thing we hang our hat on is Sabbath means rest, well, don't lose sight of that extra meaning there. It means to stop. And so God created the world in 6 days, and on day 7, he stopped from creating. He ceased creating any longer. Now that's not all. So this rhythm God wove into the fabric of the universe. This is part of creation. This is part of our world as we know it. But they're not done. This is one of the 10 commandments, incidentally. So from Exodus chapter 20, it is the 4th commandment. It's the longest of the 10 commandments. And it's the only one. 3 of them start with do not. 6 of them start with another verb like do or do not. Sabbath is the only one that starts with remember. It's the only one. This is a short version of Exodus 20, verse 9. But remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do no work. So here's what happened, and here's how we get back to where Jesus was. that was there for Israel, and they were more or less obeying those commands in different times, setting aside Sabbath. But the thinkers got together, and the thinkers said, what is work? Why did God not tell us more about work and what counts and what doesn't count? This is very confusing. It's kind of an open-ended, sort of vague command, Lord. If I milk my cow, that's work. But what about walking? Like, walking's nice, right? If I walk my garden, that's not work. But what if I climb a mountain? That's really hard. That's work. And what if I milk my neighbor's cow, but we're actually doing an experiment testing the maximum milk output based off of hybrids of grain, because that's actually kind of fun. I want to know, is that work or not work? And so if you're tracking it all with the New Testament around this idea, you start to see that there were a bunch of new restrictions created around Sabbath as safeguards. And so they came up, the Pharisees in large part, but this became standard practice, that we're going to make sure. And so in order to not work, they moved the goalposts. If we don't do any of these things, we're pretty sure we're not working, and God is happy. Now, it actually runs deeper than that, because I wondered this for a long time. Why do they care so much? It's like I understand the thought process. Yes, don't work. Work is vague. You could put some more specificity to that, okay. But it sure seems like they cared a lot. And it's a little deeper than just let's make God happy. Because as Jesus was walking Israel, they're not a free nation. We just prayed about places that don't have complete freedom. Israel was under the rule and authority of the Roman Empire. They'd been conquered. They paid taxes to Caesar. We just read about that last week. And so they're not their own people. And the Pharisees, and to be honest, most of Israel genuinely believed that they had been conquered because they weren't faithful enough to God. They thought they'd lost and been taken over by Rome as a punishment for unfaithfulness. Not a completely unreasonable thing to think if you are familiar with the Old Testament, because that did happen sometimes. God said, you guys have strayed from me, begun worshiping idols. I'm going to send a nation to conquer you to eventually bring you back to myself. So this had actually happened in their world. And though that was not spoken this time, they believed that they had strayed. The people did not live holy enough. And so if we obeyed enough, God would send someone to smack the Romans and free us. And so our hapless sidekicks wander through a field picking grain, and we have a dilemma. So Jesus is going to step in, but his response is unusual. I don't know if you caught that. So verse 24 was, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Not unlawful according to Scripture, unlawful according to the Pharisees. So Jesus responds, so he could have said what I just said. They're not doing what's unlawful to Scripture. They're doing what's unlawful to you guys. But he didn't do that. He could have said, why are you out here snooping on us anyway? Detective work kind of feels like workish on a Sabbath. He didn't do that either. He quotes a really weird passage from 1 Samuel 21. Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? Well, have you never read? We get to read it. This is from 1 Samuel chapter 21. So this is the bread that Jesus was talking about. Real story. David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? David answered Ahimelech the priest, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find." But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here." So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. Give you a 15-second summary of context if it got a little confusing at the end. Most of those words and rituals are from Exodus when they're setting up the tabernacle. And there was a system of worship, and what the priests were to do were some candles and some offerings, and the bread of the presence was baked each day, but nobody actually ate it on that day. That was an offering to the Lord, and they left it there. So that's what's being talked about. I'm more curious about this question, though. What is noticeably absent from this story that Jesus is using in defense of his disciples? There's no Sabbath anywhere. Jesus brings up this story. Why are your disciples doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus says, here's some Bible for you, with no Sabbath nowhere in sight. So he's doing something. He is appealing to a precedent, but he's not appealing to like a Sabbath tradition precedent. He's showing that in this instance, an exception was made because the king was in the room. You can have some guiding principles, and that's great, but David is embarking here in this story on a secret mission, and he has no materials. And David says to the priest, "Do you have anything I can take with you? I've got no food, and I'm about to leave." And in that case, though this bread was to be typically reserved for no one to eat until it was replaced, that was all that they had. And an exception was made because the king was in the room. He has the authority to make that kind of request, to make that kind of decision, and ultimately has the authority to define what is the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. And there's a lot going on in this conversation between these groups of people about the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. Jesus is Lord, and he's going to claim that at the end of that story. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus is just saying outright, I am the one who is able to tell you what this is for and not for. I am the one with the authority to help you understand the purpose of law. And so Jesus' very obscure reference is really in large part to say what he says here is the pivotal line in this entire interaction, both sides of the chapter. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That's what the Pharisees have misunderstood. That's what the people largely misunderstood. The Sabbath was made for them. They're not made for Sabbath stipulations. What comes to mind with that word, with made for you, with the whole concept of if this thing is made for you? Jesus says that. The Sabbath is made for you. Made for you. When do we use that? What kinds of things does that apply to? I think when we talk about stuff being made for you, it falls in this sort of atmosphere, that it's maybe specific to you. I made this for you in a way that I didn't make it for someone else. Specifically tailored to you or custom. It meets your needs or it's a perfect fit. When my kids say, I made this for you, a lot of times what that accompanies is they're giving it. It's a gift. it's a drawing, or whatever. If it's made for you, it's for you to do something with. To use, to do, to wear, to enjoy, etc., etc. And then oftentimes, maybe not every time, but oftentimes, it has a special significance because of the source. So in short, I think this is so important because this seems to be what has completely been missed, is the idea that Sabbath is a gift. Jesus says it's for them. Jesus says the idea, the whole concept, the whole structure, the whole rhythm, the whole purpose of the Sabbath is a gift. And they have casually turned it into another chore. You ever done that? God intends something for a benefit, but it's kind of just become another chore. I don't know why, but in thinking of this, a really old commercial popped into my mind. I don't know if you guys saw this commercial. I don't remember if it was a Super Bowl or not. It's over 10 years old, but this woman gave her dad an iPad. This is when iPads were pretty new. It was like a new iPad commercial. So she's chopping vegetables. She said, "Dad, how do you like your new iPad?" And he comes over. He's like, "It's great." And she says, "You able to figure out all the apps?" And he goes, "What apps?" And he finishes chopping the vegetables and scraping them into the sink. And then in the end of the commercial, he puts the iPad in the dishwasher and turns it on. Completely misused a gift. Completely. They missed the purpose entirely. I think this is where it meets the road for us. Sabbath really easily can fall into one of two extremes. On the one extreme, very pharisaical. Man, we protect this day at all costs. You do nothing. I had conversations with people who grew up in that sort of environment just during this week. When you grew up, Sabbath meant, I don't do anything. Or on the other side, you ask a lot of Christians today, and Sabbath is sort of, what is it? I'm not really sure. I go to church, and I don't go to Chick-fil-A. I know that. What is it? What do I do with this thing? What if its intent is far deeper? What if its intent is far deeper than either of those things? And I think of it this way. The Sabbath is God's gift to create in me a heart of greater dependency and worship all 7 days of the week. It's not just another activity to make sure that I do it well on that one day of the week. Sabbath is meant to do something in me. It's a gift for me. It's a pointer, not the point. So here's what I mean by that. The Old Testament predicts Jesus, the Gospels reveal Jesus, and the New Testament proclaims Jesus and looks back on him. The whole Bible is about Jesus, including the Sabbath. And so we've already seen sort of the Old Testament snapshot of what it is. There's this rhythm that's present in all the Sabbath descriptions. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. Why 6 and not 8? Not the point. What if I have a 4-day job of 10s? Not the point. This was given, remember this is really helpful. This was given to the entire Hebrew nation. What percentage of the people do you think had regular 9-to-5 careers? In fact, even in our world, I was thinking about that on the way in. The easiest application of Sabbath, if you're just casually thinking, well, I go to work, I work some days, and then I don't work, right? But how many of us live in different worlds than that? I don't know the percentage of our people that actually have a full week work or full work week and then rest, because we've got kids, we've got retired folks, we've got stay-at-home moms, we've got people that have very different hour jobs, all kinds of things out there. So how much is there to do in your world? If you don't have a career at all, but maybe you're helping raise kids, how much is there to do around your house? And still, to them, God gave a regular rhythm of 6 days on and 1 day stop. There's two reasons for this, regardless of what your job situation is like. There's a human reason and a spiritual reason for why God gave us Sabbath. The human reason is pretty simple, but acknowledging its reality is not so simple. And the simple reason is that you and I have limitations. We are not infinite beings. We have weaknesses. We have limits. You just can't go forever. Whether you want to or not, physically, we all learn to accept those limitations, whether we're wise and on rhythm with it or not. I tried one time my junior year of college. I think I had one final, so in a spring semester or something. So I tried that week. Oh no, that was senior year for sure. Tried to see how long I could go without sleeping. I did a self-experiment. I don't got much to do this week. So yeah, 50 hours in, I got really weird. But eventually, right, you got to call it quits. Could go further than my normal, but not forever. Have to learn to follow the rhythm that God built into our bodies of sleep. And that's going to apply even beyond just the 1 day to apparently you can't just get up and run every day. You have to break. You have to stop. God prescribed 6 and 1. Our whole calendar kind of operates on a 5 and 2. Yours might be different. But the ability that we all have to go 7 for 7 is right in front of you. You can run hard 7 out of 7 days if you choose to. And according to God, that is not good for us. Now, here's what's cool about the human limitation application of the Sabbath. The Bible never says that. The Bible, not in Genesis, not in Exodus, not anywhere does the Bible say, I have given you the 6 and 1 rhythm of Sabbath because your body will break down if you continue to work every day without taking a break. We just learned that through science and experiment and experience. And it turns out that God was right. All studies will reveal that rest is good for you. Every single test you want to put on the human body will prove that God knew what he was doing. We are meant to accept this in faith, that God knows what he's doing. God says, trust me, and it will go better for you. And in this particular case, he says, trust me, with actually a little bit of incomplete information. He says you need this. He doesn't say why. You may have found yourself in a place at some point in your life of trusting God with incomplete information. Not knowing the whole story of what's going to happen. But this is what God says I should do. Second reason is spiritual, which comes back again to here, to Genesis 2. Why did God rest? Obviously, the rhetorical part of that, we didn't have to. If anyone in the entire history of everything didn't need to rest, it was God. Why did God rest? Because God's work was done. God rested because his work was sufficient. It was good enough. It was done. What he had done, what he had created, what he had provided was enough. There was nothing else that needed to be added to God's work. Humans have never improved on creation. We've made some pretty cool stuff, but when you step back and look at most of the pretty cool stuff that we've ever created, it's a technological improvisation off of what God had already created. Much of our structure, much of our art, even much of our science is just trying to replicate what the body can do or should do on its own. I mean, on and on and on. We haven't improved on God. He created and it was good, and there was nothing else that God had to create. You know the other time that somebody said that they were done? When Jesus died on the cross in John 19, he said, "It is finished." Hebrews 10 has a curious phrase, but it says, after providing purification for sins, Jesus sat down at the right hand of the Father. It was done. Nothing more needed to be added. Jesus bought you from hell and paid for your sins and redeemed your soul. I don't have to do it. Jesus did it for me. Our work, since that's what this battle is about, if all of that is true, and I believe it is, then our work, such as it is to have faith that God's work actually was sufficient. That when Jesus said it's done, he meant it. To let go and let God take it, and I will be okay. A literal stop of trying to get there, or trying to make it better, or trying to make it perfect. To trust that what God did is all that needed to be done. And if I believe that, and if I reorient my life around that reality, I will be fine. So Sabbath points us to this. Sabbath tells us that reality. In fact, it does more than this. Sabbath, as practiced, helps us kind of learn that in our lifestyle. So it's one thing, right? We talk about this quite a bit here. It's one thing to say something or to agree with it in my mind. It's another thing altogether to have that be at a faith level where my life choices actually reflect that. That's different than just mentally agreeing, yeah, Sabbath says Jesus did it for me. It helps us embrace a lifestyle and a mentality of true gospel rest. Again, God already proved it's better for us. If you don't sleep, you die. If you don't rest, you break down. But let's go deeper. The 6-in-1 rhythm, the work, then rest rhythm, helps me acknowledge that I was put here in part to work hard. God gave me some things that are within my ability to do. Whatever that is, I should do those well. And also to admit my limitations, to admit my dependency on God, and to rest that God the provider will provide. So the question that comes to us then as Jesus is having this fight in the middle of the grain field, do you trust that? Do you really trust that? Do you trust that enough to stake your life on it? Because that is what he is asking. He's saying, if you take your foot off the gas, I will drive. It's risky. Do you trust it enough to restructure your life? We'll come there in just a second. This gap between what Jesus intends Sabbath and what people want Sabbath to be, that gap exists because I am an inherently distrusting person. Maybe you are as well. I deeply mistrust that other people will live up to my expectations. Maybe my preferred method of doing something. I assume that people will not do things the way I want them to. Now, here's what's curious. I think, like a lot of these battles, there's some redeemable stuff within that. But a lot of times, what can be used for good also can become an incredible stumbling block. I went into ministry because I grew up around the church, and through my dad and other connections, I got access to a lot of preaching. And I looked around at a lot of preaching, and I felt deep within my soul God saying, you can do something with Scripture that people today need to hear. And if I'm being honest, there are moments where my call to ministry, which I believe was legit, was genuine, was humble, had a competitive element to it. Especially 22-year-old me, right? How would I have vocalized it back then? I can do better. I said that. I saw large churches led by men who misused the Bible and left their people starving and desperate for the Word of God. And I felt the Lord leading me to meet a need that in certain places was not being met. And I treasure that. It's a great source of motivation for me, why I continue to be in ministry the way that I am. But sitting right there in the shadows is the dark side of me. The side that says, I don't like the way you do it. I don't trust the way that you do it. And I've shared with people, even in this church, especially in the early ways, I struggle to trust that God cares more about rooted than I do. That's the dark side. That's why there's Sabbath. God cares more than you do about whatever it is. We've left off the poor second half of our story, which in one sense feels pretty different, but Jesus has one last lesson he wants to throw in here for us. One last layer. This will get more into the, all right, that was a lot, but what do I do? What day do I pick? What activities go into my Sabbath? Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him. Again, man, this is the first time. I know if you've read the Bible a lot, we portray the Pharisees as bad guys always, but chronologically in the Gospel of Mark, they haven't been bad guys until right now. They actually were just confused guys. Now, for the first time, they're bad guys. And it was over the Sabbath. Because it is hard to depend on God. I don't know why, other than I'm selfish. But it is hard. And they don't want to do it. So now we got bad guys. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then he asks his second question. I guess the first was a statement. The second is a question. Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? That's like not a hard question. Jesus asks some pretty hard questions. This is not one of them, but they remained silent. Because it's hard to admit that I am dependent on me, not on God. What's their answer? Don't do anything on Sabbath. So he looked around in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Ignoring for a moment the irony that Mark puts in here, in this whole battle, Jesus didn't actually do any work. He just said, stretch out your hand, and it was healed, because this is not work for God. But it didn't appear that way to them. But I do want to scale that back, because Jesus chose this interaction. Jesus went to the synagogue on Sabbath. He kind of did do some work. He went there. He found this guy. Jesus had an interaction. He chose to hear his story. Jesus chose to bring healing. Again, ironically, no actual work to him, but as we see it, Jesus is doing some stuff. He did do work, but he said, doing good is good work. This is how we know, this is another reinforcement that Sabbath is about rhythm and trust and heart posture, not about making the effort to do literally nothing. Is it possible that Jesus here is implying that doing something that gives life to another is an appropriate use of Sabbath rest? I find this helpful because of how we've kind of taken the concept on, especially with work and weekends and all those kinds of things. It's a helpful reminder because we might consider like rest or cease from work and me time as synonyms. And I'm not convinced that Jesus would proclaim those as synonyms. So Sabbath says stop from your work. And I don't know if what we might picture sometimes as a rest or a Sabbath, he might not see that exactly the same. Biblically, they're not synonyms. So just consider this. It's an application question. If God intended rest, this idea of Sabbath, if God intended rest to be a blessing for me, should I not also be at least a little bit concerned about what God considers rest or restful? Doing good might not be on your, if you're going to write down a bullet list, what's the 5 most restful activities in your life? You might not have put, go find a guy with a shriveled hand and try to heal him. Might not have made the list. But I think that's a valuable question. If God intended rest to be a blessing to me, what does God consider good, restful activities? And again, just thinking average, most of us, if you got a day off or relaxing time or whatever, how much of that goes to isolation and screens and social media? Those things are pretty high on a lot of lists. I'll give you it. It might bring some life. But he's not reiterating their desire to protect Sabbath by doing nothing. Again, he's reframing Sabbath in terms of a heart posture and a rhythm of accepting that what God has already done. And then I think Jesus is freed up for something here that's especially curious. I don't know what Jesus' intent was when he went to the synagogue. This man with the shriveled hand might have been an interruption. It doesn't say Jesus went to go heal. He went to the synagogue. He usually did that on Sabbath. This might have been an interruption. And I can say with certainty throughout the Gospels, Jesus deals well with a great number of interruptions. And here's one just practical tool for Sabbath. Because I think the 6 in 1 is very important. And let's just say it this way. Do you have at any moment of your week a 24-hour period that is specifically set aside as different than the rest of your week? We're not asking what is work, what is not work. But if Jesus does buy into what the Old Testament says, as this is a day set apart, a day holy, do you have a period of your week that is set aside specifically as different than the rest of your week? And what would it take to make that so? Because again, casually, I think if we're talking about Sabbath or we're asking people about their typical Christian practices, and I don't care if you pick Saturday, Sunday, or any day in between, mine typically is Friday. But what happens when there's interruptions? Jesus has structured his life in such a way that he is actually able to receive God's interruptions and do those things. His life was not so fully packed of activity that he couldn't deviate. His life was not so busy that there was no time to breathe. There was no time to think. There was no time to be flexible. Sabbath and that rhythm of work and rest was such that Jesus reoriented his life around that. I think of how many times we can let the little non-urgent things become really consequential in our life. And suddenly a little hit of anxiety here and another reminder of something to do there. And oh man, I'm planning ahead here. And we've got the internet so we can do everything at lightning fast pace and work or see news from anywhere at any time. And God has specifically said, what if you lived in such a way that you trusted on that seventh day to just let what happens, and that God will take care of it? Again, it's not really about the one day. It's about trusting God's provision in such a way that I become a better worshiper of Him all 7 days. Both on the cross and in my life, it's about trusting that God cares at least as much as I do about me, if not infinitely more. That He'll take care of me. And that following God's intended rhythm of work and rest is both healthy for me and can literally train me to accept that theological truth better. I live in such a way that I believe it easier. Adopting that same attitude towards the grace of Jesus allows me to find real rest. What do you need to stop? It might not be your job, but to find real rest from achieving, from fitting in, from worry, from fear, avoiding. So it's actually putting the center of the target on the sufficiency of the work of Jesus. And he said that we can make that a practice, that our literal structure and rhythm of our week lets me more freely worship and rest the other 6 days too. That I am, or at least I am growing to be a restful person. That I'm not marked by jitteriness, by the next thing, by these big surges of activity and isolation. I mean, so many different rhythms that we can adopt. And yet there's one that I am marked by a restful person, trusting in God's sufficiency. Now again, this is the second week where we've pressed into something, and I cannot literally tell you what to do. I can't give you the answers. But my sense as Jesus does this is why the gospel translates so well from a grain field in 1st century AD Israel to us, is that this is a thing I can do, and you have better answers of how to do this than I do. You know what God's telling you to stop. So my prayer for us is that we would trust, and then that our rhythm would reflect that trust. So let's take that to Him. God, thank you for meeting us in our deepest need. Way before we get to any questions of Saturday or Sunday or reading books or taking naps, way before any of that, God, that you met the need for salvation. That I literally could not work myself towards. That I cannot accomplish that. God, would you forgive me for that and all the other moments where I have decided I can do a better job than you? Though you've called me to yourself, I still pick my way too many times. God, help me to rest because I trust. In your name we pray. Amen.